The courtroom was silent, but the weight in the air was crushing. Every eye in the room was locked on the young girl standing before the judge, her small frame trembling as she clutched the edges of her tattered hoodie. 17-year-old Ayanna. Wells did not belong in a place like this. She was not a hardened criminal, not some repeat offender with a long list of charges. She was just a girl, hungry, desperate, and caught in a system that had never been built to protect her. The prosecutor's voice was cold and firm as he read the charges. Grand larceny, theft, criminal intent. Each word felt like a hammer, striking the nail into Ayanna's coffin. Her lips parted, but no words came out. What could she even say? She had stolen food, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a pack of apples. She had not done it for fun or greed. She had done it because her stomach ached from days without a real meal, because her little brother, back home, had cried himself to sleep the night before, whispering about the hunger clawing at his belly. But none of that seemed to matter. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and an expression as unmoving as stone, glanced down at the file. Before him, his voice lacked even a hint of compassion. Miss Wells, do you have anything to say for yourself? Ayanna swallowed hard. I was hungry, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The courtroom erupted into whispers and murmurs. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others glanced at her with pity. But Ayanna knew how this would go. People like her did not get mercy. The judge sighed, flipping through her record. This is not your first offense, he said. You were caught trespassing last year, loitering before that, and now, theft. Loitering? That had been because she had nowhere to go. Trespassing? That had been because she had found an abandoned house to sleep in for the night. But to them, those were crimes, not cries for help. Then came the moment that made the air in the courtroom freeze. The judge set down his papers, looked straight at Ayanna, and said, "Given your record and the nature of this crime, I see no choice but to issue the maximum sentence allowed under the law." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Effective immediately, you are sentenced to life in prison. The gasp that followed was deafening. Ayanna's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Life? For stealing food? She looked around the room, searching for a sign that this was some kind of mistake. Her public defender sat still, expressionless, as if he had expected this all along. Tears welled in Ayanna's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her fists, trying to push down the panic rising in her chest. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a man stood. He had been silent the entire trial, watching, listening. But now, he stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is a gross miscarriage of justice," he said, his voice calm but firm. All eyes turned to him. A tall, well-dressed man with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded attention. "And who are you?" the judge asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Julian Carter, civil rights attorney." The judge's expression hardened. "You are not representing this case." "Not yet," Julian said, "but I am now." Ayanna's eyes widened. She had never seen this man before, but something in his voice, in the way he stood with such confidence, made her heart pound with hope. Julian turned to Ayanna, then back to the judge. "I have reason to believe that this case is not just about a stolen loaf of bread, and I intend to expose exactly what is going on in this courtroom." The tension in the room thickened. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, Mr. Carter." Julian's smile grew. "Oh, trust me, Your Honor. I am watching everything." And just like that, the trial had taken a turn no one saw coming. The courtroom was still. Every person inside could feel the shift in energy, like something big was about to happen. Ayanna barely breathed as she looked at Julian Carter, the lawyer who had stepped in like a ghost appearing out of nowhere. She did not know if she could trust him, but right now, he was the only person standing between her and a life behind bars. The judge cleared his throat, his annoyance barely hidden. "Mr. Carter, unless you were formally assigned to this case, I suggest you take your seat and let the court proceed." Julian did not move. He adjusted his tie, calm as ever. "Actually, Your Honor, I have just filed my intent to represent Miss Wells." It was submitted to the clerk's office before this hearing began. The judge blinked, clearly caught off guard. He glanced at the court clerk, who quickly checked her system. A moment later, she gave a small nod. It is confirmed, Your Honor. The tension in the judge's face tightened. He did not like surprises. This is highly unusual. So is sentencing a starving teenager to life for stealing food, Julian said smoothly. A few gasps rippled through the room, but Julian did not seem fazed. He turned to Ayanna. Miss Wells, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer. Honestly. His voice was steady, firm, but somehow kind. Ayanna hesitated before giving a small nod. Did anyone read you your rights when you were arrested? Her lips parted slightly. The officers who took her in had barely spoken to her. They had thrown her into the back of the squad car like she was a piece of trash, but she could not remember anyone telling her about her rights. She shook her head. No. Julian's eyes flashed with something sharp, something dangerous. And when you were questioned, did they give you a lawyer? No, she whispered. The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Julian turned back to the judge. Your Honor, we have a serious violation of due process here. My client was denied legal counsel and was never read her Miranda rights. That alone is enough to have this entire case thrown out. The judge's expression darkened. He looked at the prosecutor, who seemed just as unsettled. Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say about this? The prosecutor, a stiff man in a navy suit, cleared his throat. This is the first I am hearing of such claims, Your Honor. However, even if that were the case, the evidence is overwhelming. She was caught on camera committing the crime. Julian smirked. And the punishment for stealing food is life in prison? He let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Tell me, Mr. Reynolds, how many other cases have you prosecuted where a minor was sentenced this harshly for theft? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. The law allows the judge to issue a ruling based on the individual's record. Julian nodded. Right. And Miss Wells' record consists of loitering and trespassing. Hardly violent crimes. The judge slammed his gavel. That is enough. This court will not be turned into a spectacle. His gaze bore into Julian. If you wish to argue your case, you will need to file an appeal. Julian crossed his arms. You want me to file an appeal on a case that should not even exist? This is not justice, Your Honor. This is something else entirely. The way he said it made the room feel even smaller. There was something hidden beneath his words, something unspoken, and it sent a chill through Ayanna's spine. The judge straightened. Regardless, the court has made its ruling. Miss Wells will be taken into custody immediately. A sharp pain shot through Ayanna's chest. The officers moved toward her, handcuffs in hand. She could feel her legs shaking. Julian stepped forward. That would be a mistake. The officers hesitated. The judge narrowed his eyes. Mr. Carter, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. Julian's jaw tightened. Then let me make this clear. If you take one step toward my client, I will file a lawsuit against this court, the prosecution, and every officer involved in her arrest. And I will not stop until I uncover the truth. The judge's face paled slightly, but he masked it quickly. The truth? He scoffed. Julian tilted his head. Oh, you know exactly what I am talking about. The room felt suffocating. Ayanna could barely keep up with what was happening, but she knew one thing. Julian Carter was not just a lawyer. He was a man who had walked into this courtroom with a plan. The judge took a slow breath. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody while this matter is reviewed. Ayanna felt her heart sink. It was not freedom, but at least it was not a life sentence. The officers grabbed her arms, leading her away. Before she disappeared, through the door, she turned her head. Julian met her eyes, and for the first time in days, she saw something she had almost forgotten existed, hope. As she was led away, she could hear him speaking again, his voice calm but cutting. This case is far from over, Your Honor, and I will find out exactly why you are so desperate to make sure this girl disappears. The judge did not respond, but Ayanna knew this was only the beginning. The cold metal cuffs pressed against Ayanna's wrists as she was led through the courthouse hallways, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs around her. Every step felt heavier than the last, her body tense, waiting for something, anything, to change. She did not know what was worse. The reality of being locked away or the hopelessness creeping in, telling her that maybe she would never walk free again. But as she reached the exit leading to the holding cells, she heard a voice behind her. Wait. The officer gripping her arm hesitated, turning back. It was Julian Carter. He had followed them, his expression unreadable, his steps slow but deliberate. I want to speak with my client. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something unshakable. The officer frowned but glanced at the other guard, who gave a small nod. Without another word, they steered Ayanna into a side room, a small space with only a table and 2 chairs. They uncuffed one of her wrists, chaining the other to the table before stepping out. Julian took a seat across from her, setting his briefcase down but not opening it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, studying her. You all right? He asked. She almost laughed at the question. How could she be all right? But something about the way he said it made her pause. No one had really asked her that before, not like they meant it. I do not know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian nodded, as if he expected that answer. He sat back, tapping a finger on the table. I need you to tell me everything, Ayanna. Not just about today, about your life, your family, how you ended up in that store. I need to know what they are trying to bury. Her throat tightened. I stole food, she said. That is it. He tilted his head slightly. No, that is what they want everyone to believe. But cases like this? They do not just happen. Someone wants you out of the way. She blinked. That does not make sense. I am nobody. Julian's lips pressed into a thin line. Not to them, apparently. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he was wrong. But the way he looked at her, like he had already seen this pattern before, made her hesitate. My mom died last year, she said quietly. It has just been me and my little brother since then. Julian nodded, encouraging her to continue. We had nowhere to go after she passed. No one to help. I tried to keep us in school, keep him fed, but she swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in her throat. There was no money. I got kicked out of a shelter because I was not 18 yet. I tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a kid with no address. Julian exhaled slowly, his fingers steepling. And what about your arrest record? Trespassing? Loitering? She looked down. The trespassing charge was because I found an empty house. I just needed a place to sleep for one night. The loitering charge was because I was outside a restaurant, hoping someone would throw away food. Julian did not react right away. He just studied her, his gaze sharp but thoughtful. And no one ever helped? She let out a bitter laugh. I stopped expecting help a long time ago. Julian leaned forward. That is the problem, Ayanna. You should not have had to expect it. It should have been there. For a moment, she did not know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Julian pulled out his phone, scrolling through something before turning the screen toward her. Do you recognize this judge? She frowned, looking at the image. It was the same judge who had sentenced her, but the picture was from some kind of event. He was shaking hands with another man, someone older, dressed in an expensive suit. No, she admitted. Julian nodded. His name is Judge Whitaker. He has a long history of handing out extreme sentences, especially in cases like yours. And the man next to him? He tapped the screen. That is Raymond Greer, a major investor in private prisons. Her stomach turned. What does that mean? Julian sighed. It means there is a reason why cases like yours keep happening. People like Greer make money every time a prison bed is filled. And judges like Whitaker? They make sure those beds do not stay empty. Her breath hitched. So they want me locked up just to profit, Julian finished. Yes. She felt like she could not breathe. The weight of it all settled on her chest, pressing down hard. She had always known the system was unfair, but she had never imagined it worked like this. Julian sat back, watching her reaction carefully. This is why they came down so hard on you. They thought no one would question it. But they did not expect me to be here. Ayana clenched her fists. What do we do? Julian smiled slightly. We fight. The words should have felt impossible, but something about the way he said them made her believe, just for a second, that maybe she had a chance. A knock on the door made them both look up. The officer stepped inside. Time is up. Julian stood, grabbing his briefcase. I will see you soon, Ayana. And I promise you this. We are going to make them regret ever thinking they could get away with this. As she was led away, the fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope.